The moment that changed everything came, without warning, at 5:47 a.m. Sarah was helping a nervous passenger in row 22 when the aircraft's collision avoidance system began screaming. The piercing alarm cut through the cabin like a knife, followed immediately by Captain Williams' voice over the intercom. Brace! 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 Sarah threw herself across the passenger she had been helping as the Boeing 777 dove into the most aggressive evasive maneuver she had ever experienced. The aircraft rolled hard left while simultaneously diving, throwing everyone not properly secured against the cabin walls. Through the chaos, she glimpsed what had triggered the emergency maneuver. A surface-to-air missile, bright as a falling star, streaked past their right wing so close that its exhaust trail was visible through the windows. Someone had actually fired at them. As the aircraft leveled out from its evasive dive, Captain Williams' voice returned, strained but controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, we have just avoided a missile that was not intended for our aircraft. I repeat, we are not the target, but we are in an active combat zone. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing procedures. The cabin erupted into controlled panic as the reality of their situation finally became undeniable. These weren't training exercises anymore. Someone was shooting live missiles in their immediate vicinity. Sarah pulled herself upright, her training kicking in despite her terror. Around her, passengers were crying, praying, and holding each other while the other flight attendants stood frozen in shock. Jessica, Sarah called out firmly, I need you to secure the forward galley. Mrs. Patterson, check for injuries in your section. Mr. Hayes, prepare emergency equipment. For the first time in 6 years, no one questioned her authority. The dismissed junior crew member had become the person everyone looked to for direction. Sarah moved through the cabin systematically, checking for injuries from the violent evasive maneuver while projecting calm confidence she didn't feel. Several passengers had minor cuts from loose objects, and one elderly man was having chest pains that could be a heart attack. David, she called to David Kumar, who had proven himself reliable throughout the crisis. I need your help with medical assistance. Do you have any first aid training? Some, he replied, moving quickly to help with the elderly passenger. As they worked to stabilize the man with chest pains, Sarah could hear increasingly desperate radio communications from the cockpit. Multiple voices in multiple languages were trying to coordinate safe passage for their aircraft while military operations continued around them. Skyline 447, this is NATO control, came an American voice. We are attempting to establish safe corridor, but Russian forces are not responding to deconfliction requests. NATO control, this is Russian air defense, a heavily accented voice replied. Your aircraft is in restricted zone during active exercise. We cannot guarantee safety if aircraft remains in sector. Captain Williams' response was sharp with frustration. This is Skyline 447. We are a civilian airliner with 347 people on board. We need immediate safe passage to international airspace. We did not choose to enter this area. But the military controllers seemed more concerned with their operational objectives than with civilian safety. Sarah could hear the tension building in their voices as each side demanded that the other provide safe passage while refusing to coordinate their own actions. Through the window, she could see they were now surrounded by military aircraft from multiple countries. NATO fighters maintained position on their left while Russian jets held the right side. Below them, Sarah could make out what appeared to be naval vessels on the dark ocean surface. Ma'am, called out a young passenger near the window, there are ships down there, and they're launching something. Sarah looked down to see bright flashes from the ships below, followed by streaks of light arcing upward. More missiles, though whether they were targeting aircraft or other ships was impossible to determine. The realization hit her that they weren't just flying through a military exercise. They were caught in the middle of an actual military engagement between NATO and Russian forces. The exercise had escalated into real combat, and their civilian aircraft was trapped in the crossfire. She made her way back to the cockpit where Captain Williams was in heated discussion with air traffic controllers from multiple countries, each giving conflicting instructions. Captain, Sarah said quietly, the passengers need to know what's really happening. They can see the combat below us. Captain Williams looked at her with exhausted eyes. What's really happening is that we've stumbled into the start of a shooting war, and Everyone down there is more concerned with winning than with getting us out safely. How do we get out? We're trying to convince both sides to establish a temporary ceasefire corridor, but neither wants to give the other a tactical advantage by ceasing operations. First Officer Jackson looked up from his controls. We have enough fuel for maybe 2 more hours at current consumption. After that, we'll have to land somewhere, whether it's safe or not. The aircraft shuddered again as another missile passed nearby, this one close enough to trigger multiple warning systems. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see explosions in the distance as missiles found their targets among the military aircraft. "Sir," Sarah said, "what if we try something different? What if instead of asking permission, we just declare a medical emergency?" Captain Williams looked puzzled. Medical emergency? That elderly passenger is having cardiac symptoms. It's not fake. He really is in distress. International law requires all parties to allow medical emergency aircraft safe passage. Captain Williams' eyes lit up with understanding. Declare medical emergency. Request immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport regardless of military operations. Sarah hurried back to the cabin where the elderly passenger was indeed experiencing serious cardiac symptoms. David Kumar had been monitoring him and reported that his condition was worsening. "This is actually a real medical emergency now," David confirmed. "He needs immediate medical attention on the ground." Sarah returned to the cockpit as Captain Williams keyed his radio for what might be the most important transmission of his career. All stations, this is Skyline 447 declaring medical emergency. We have passenger experiencing cardiac event requiring immediate medical attention. Request emergency clearance to nearest suitable airport under international medical emergency protocols." The response was immediate, but not encouraging. Skyline 447, this is NATO control. Nearest suitable airport is an active combat zone. Cannot guarantee safe approach. Skyline 447, this is Russian control. Medical emergency acknowledged, but safe landing cannot be assured while NATO forces remain in area. Each side was acknowledging the emergency, but refusing to take responsibility for ensuring safe passage while the other side remained active in the area. Captain Williams tried a different approach. All military stations, this is Skyline 447. We are requesting temporary humanitarian ceasefire for medical emergency. 1 hour cessation of hostilities to allow civilian aircraft emergency landing. The radio fell silent for several long minutes. Sarah could imagine the frantic communications taking place between military commanders and political leaders as they tried to decide whether to pause their conflict for humanitarian reasons. Finally, a new voice came over the radio, speaking with obvious authority. "Skyline 447, this is Admiral Morrison, NATO Task Force Commander. We are prepared to cease offensive operations for 1 hour to allow your emergency landing, contingent on reciprocal agreement from Russian forces." Moments later, Skyline 447, this is General Petrov, Russian Defense Command. We agree to 1 hour cessation for humanitarian purposes, effective immediately. Sarah felt weak with relief as Captain Williams acknowledged the agreement and began coordinating their emergency approach to a military airfield in Scotland. But as they began their descent, she realized their ordeal was far from over. Landing at a military base during an active conflict meant they would be surrounded by armed forces from multiple countries, all of whom would want to question everyone on board about what they had witnessed. The dismissed cabin crew member who had held together a plane load of terrified passengers would now have to help them navigate interrogation by intelligence services from multiple nations, all while ensuring their elderly passenger received the medical care that had saved all their lives. As the aircraft touched down on the military runway, Sarah looked out at the armed personnel surrounding the aircraft and realized that surviving the missiles had been only the beginning of their ordeal. The young flight attendant who had been dismissed by her colleagues had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. But as they rolled to a stop surrounded by military vehicles, she knew the real test of her leadership was just beginning. Captain Williams' voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely. Please remain seated as ground personnel will be boarding the aircraft shortly for security and medical procedures." Sarah straightened her uniform and prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that she had found her true calling in the most unlikely circumstances. The missiles hadn't destroyed their aircraft, but they had destroyed any doubt about her capabilities as a flight attendant. As military personnel boarded the aircraft, Sarah stepped forward to coordinate passenger assistance with the same calm authority she had demonstrated at 35,000 feet. The crisis had revealed who she really was, and there was no going back to being dismissed or overlooked ever again. The emergency descent felt like falling through space as Sarah braced herself against the galley wall. Around her, passengers stirred from sleep with confused murmurs that quickly turned to concerned voices. The cabin lighting automatically brightened, casting harsh shadows across worried faces as people reached for their seatbelts. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Captain Williams' voice carried forced calm over the intercom. "We are making an unscheduled descent due to air traffic control instructions. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, take your positions immediately." Sarah's heart hammered as she moved through the cabin, but her training took over. While Jessica and the other senior attendants fumbled with emergency checklists, Sarah found herself moving with surprising clarity and purpose. "What's happening?" Mrs. Chin called out, clutching her armrest as the plane continued its steep descent. "Just a precautionary measure," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Please make sure your seatbelt is tight and your seat is upright." But through the window, she could see something that made her blood freeze. In the distance, barely visible against the pre-dawn darkness, were tiny lights moving in formation. Aircraft lights. Military aircraft lights. David Kumar caught her eye from his seat, his expression confirming what she feared. Those weren't commercial aircraft out there. The intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't Captain Williams' voice. It was air traffic control, and somehow the communication was being broadcast to the cabin. "Skyline 447, you are approaching restricted airspace. Maintain current descent and heading 180. Military escorts will guide you to safe corridor." Military escorts. The words hung in the air like a death sentence as passengers began to understand they weren't dealing with routine operational issues. Sarah watched Jessica freeze in the middle aisle, her usual commanding presence cracking under pressure she had never trained for. The other senior attendants looked equally lost, their routine emergency procedures inadequate for this unprecedented situation. "Jessica," Sarah called out quietly, "we need to keep everyone calm. Should I make an announcement about what to expect?" I don't know," Jessica stammered, her face pale. "This isn't covered in any of our emergency protocols." For the first time in 6 years, Sarah found herself taking charge. "Mrs. Patterson, can you help with the passengers in rows 20 through 30? Mr. Hayes, take the forward section. I'll coordinate with the cockpit." The other attendants, grateful for direction, quickly moved to their assigned areas. Sarah made her way to the cockpit, where she found Captain Williams and First Officer Jackson in tense communication with multiple ground stations. "Sir, what can you tell us about the situation?" Sarah asked. Captain Williams looked up from his controls, sweat beading on his forehead. "We've been intercepted by military aircraft. Apparently, we inadvertently entered airspace that was supposed to be cleared for a military exercise. The exercise went live earlier than scheduled." Intercepted? Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "2 Russian Su-27 fighters are escorting us to what they're calling a safe corridor," First Officer Jackson explained grimly. "The problem is that NATO forces are also in the area, conducting their own exercises." Sarah understood immediately. Their commercial airliner was caught between opposing military forces, either of which might consider them a threat, depending on whose airspace they were actually in. "How long until we're clear?" she asked. "Unknown," Captain Williams replied. "We're waiting for diplomatic clearance from both sides. Could be minutes, could be hours." Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could now clearly see the military aircraft flanking them. Sleek, deadly fighters that made their Boeing 777 feel like a lumbering whale. Red stars on the wings confirmed they were Russian aircraft. "Captain, the passengers are getting scared," Sarah reported. "What should we tell them?" "The truth, but carefully," he replied. "We're being escorted through contested airspace as a safety precaution. We're not in immediate danger as long as everyone remains calm, and we follow instructions precisely." Sarah nodded and returned to the cabin, where anxiety was spreading through the passengers like wildfire. Parents held their children closer, business travelers stared out windows at the escort fighters, and several people were attempting to use their phones despite being at altitude. "May I have your attention, please?" Sarah announced over the cabin intercom. Her voice carried surprising authority that caused conversations to quiet immediately. "We are currently being escorted through international airspace by military aircraft as a safety precaution. This is standard procedure when commercial flights need to transit areas where military exercises are taking place. Our pilots are in constant communication with air traffic control and military authorities from multiple countries." She paused, looking across the sea of worried faces. "I know this is frightening, but I want you to understand that we are not in immediate danger. Military pilots are highly trained professionals who know the difference between commercial and military aircraft. We are following all proper procedures, and we'll be through this area shortly." Dr. Foster, the political science professor, raised her hand. "Are we caught between NATO and Russian forces?" Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy. "Yes, we are transiting an area where both sides are conducting exercises. That's why we have escorts to ensure all parties know we are a civilian aircraft." "What if someone makes a mistake?" called out a passenger from the middle section. "Military pilots don't make those kinds of mistakes," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt. "They have sophisticated identification equipment and are in constant communication with their command structures. Our aircraft is clearly identified as civilian on all radar systems." But even as she spoke, Sarah noticed the escort fighters had moved closer to their aircraft. Through the windows, she could see the pilots in their cockpits, helmets turning to observe the airliner. David Kumar approached her discreetly as she moved through the cabin. "I've been listening to air traffic control frequencies on my scanner app," he whispered. "There's a lot of radio chatter about unidentified aircraft in this sector. I think there are more military planes out there than just our escorts." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How many more?" "Hard to tell, but I'm hearing multiple call signs from both NATO and Russian forces. We might be flying through the middle of a much larger military standoff than the pilots are telling us." As if to confirm David's fears, the aircraft suddenly banked hard to the right. Through the windows, passengers could see bright streaks of light in the distance. Not aircraft lights, but something moving much faster. "Those are missiles," David said quietly, his face pale. "Training missiles, hopefully, but missiles nonetheless." Sarah's training had never covered anything like this. Commercial aviation simply wasn't supposed to encounter military combat exercises, even training exercises with live weapons. She made her way back to the cockpit, where the tension was palpable. Captain Williams was speaking rapidly with someone on the radio, while First Officer Jackson monitored multiple radar screens. "Sir, passengers are asking about the lights they're seeing outside," Sarah reported. "Military exercise," Captain Williams replied tersely. "Both sides are conducting training with live weapons. We're in a designated safe corridor, but the corridor keeps moving as the exercise evolves." "Moving?" Sarah asked with alarm. "The safe zone is being adjusted in real time based on where the military aircraft are operating," First Officer Jackson explained. "We have to keep changing course to stay in areas that both sides agree are off-limits." Through the cockpit radio, Sarah could hear increasingly urgent communications between various air traffic control centers. Words like missile lock and target acquisition mixed with calls for immediate deconfliction. "Captain," came a new voice over the radio, heavily accented English that was clearly Russian. "American aircraft approaching from your 2 o'clock position. Maintain current heading. Do not deviate." Moments later, a different voice with an American accent. "Skyline 447. We have visual contact. NATO aircraft will escort you through this sector. Follow our lead." Sarah realized with horror that their aircraft was becoming a focal point for military forces from both sides, each wanting to control the situation. Captain Williams keyed his microphone. "This is Skyline 447. We are a civilian airliner with 347 souls on board requesting immediate clearance to neutral airspace. We do not require military escort from either party." "Negative, Skyline 447, came the Russian response. "You are in airspace under Russian control. Maintain escort protocol." Skyline 447. This is NATO control, the American voice countered. You are transiting international airspace under NATO protection. Follow NATO escort aircraft. Sarah felt sick as she realized what was happening. Their plane had become a pawn in a much larger geopolitical standoff. Each side wanted to demonstrate control over the airspace, and their civilian aircraft was being used as a symbol. What do we do? She asked Captain Williams. We follow whoever is closest, and try not to provoke anyone, he replied grimly. And we pray this doesn't escalate. But escalation seemed inevitable as more aircraft appeared on their radar screens. The sky around them was filling with military jets from multiple nations, all operating in the same contested airspace. Sarah returned to the cabin where passengers were becoming increasingly agitated. The frequent course changes and visible military aircraft were making it impossible to maintain the illusion of routine operations. Mrs. Chun flagged her down again. Dear, I've lived through wars before. This feels like the moments before something very bad happens. Sarah knelt beside the elderly woman's seat. We're going to be fine. The pilots know what they're doing. It's not the pilots I'm worried about, Mrs. Chun replied quietly. It's all those young men in fighter jets who might be too eager to prove themselves. As if summoned by her words, the aircraft shuddered as something passed very close to them at high speed. Through the windows, passengers could see a NATO fighter jet that had apparently intercepted their Russian escorts. The radio chatter in the cockpit became increasingly frantic as multiple military controllers tried to direct the civilian aircraft while coordinating their own forces. This is getting out of hand, Sarah heard Captain Williams tell his co-pilot. We need to get out of this airspace immediately. But getting out was proving impossible as their safe corridor kept shifting with the evolving military situation. Every course change brought them closer to additional military aircraft until the sky around them resembled an aerial battleground. Sarah found herself moving through the cabin with growing urgency, checking on passengers and trying to project calm while her own fear mounted. The dismissed junior flight attendant was now the steadying presence holding together a plane load of terrified people as they flew through increasingly dangerous skies. Outside the windows, missile trails streaked through the darkness as the military exercise continued around them, each weapon's path a reminder of how quickly their situation could turn from frightening to catastrophic. Sarah Martinez adjusted her crisp Navy uniform for the 100th time that morning, smoothing down the golden wings pinned to her blazer. At 28, she had been flying with Skyline Airlines for 6 years, but today felt different. The pre-flight briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as Captain Williams reviewed the route from Los Angeles to Dubai with a refueling stop in Frankfurt. Weather conditions are favorable, but we're monitoring some political tensions in Eastern Europe, Captain Williams announced to the crew of 12. Nothing that should affect our flight path, but stay alert. Sarah caught the eye roll from Jessica, the senior flight attendant. At 42, Jessica had been flying international routes for nearly 2 decades and made no secret of her belief that Sarah was too young and inexperienced for long-haul flights. The other crew members often echoed Jessica's sentiment, treating Sarah more like an intern than an equal colleague. Martinez, you'll be working coach section again, Jessica said with barely concealed condescension. Try not to spill anything on the passengers this time. Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. The spilling incident had happened 3 months ago during severe turbulence, and Jessica had never let her forget it. Despite Sarah's spotless record otherwise, she remained relegated to the back of the plane while more senior attendants worked first class and business. The Boeing 777 was nearly full with 347 passengers, including families traveling for vacation, business executives, and a group of college students heading to Europe for a semester abroad. Sarah moved through the economy cabin during boarding, helping passengers stow luggage and answering questions with genuine warmth that contrasted sharply with some of her colleagues' mechanical politeness. Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman traveling alone to visit her daughter in Germany, struggled with her carry-on bag. Without hesitation, Sarah lifted it into the overhead compartment. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Chun said gratefully. "You're very kind." "It's my pleasure," Sarah replied, making sure Mrs. Chun was comfortable in her seat. These moments reminded her why she loved her job, despite the daily challenges from her own crew. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Sarah noticed a man in 14C acting nervous. David Kumar, according to the passenger manifest, kept checking his phone and glancing around anxiously. His passport indicated he was an engineer returning to Dubai after a business conference. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Sarah asked quietly. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, but his hands were shaking slightly. "First time flying?" Sarah asked with a gentle smile. "No, I fly often for work. It's just—" He hesitated. "I have a bad feeling about something." "Probably nothing." Sarah made a mental note to check on him during the flight. Her training had taught her to pay attention to passenger behavior, though she'd never encountered anything more serious than anxiety or intoxication. The takeoff went smoothly, and once they reached cruising altitude, the crew began meal service. Sarah worked efficiently in the cramped galley, preparing trays and beverages while listening to Jessica's latest complaints about airline management. "They keep hiring these young girls who think flying is glamorous," Jessica muttered loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Half of them quit within 2 years when they realize it's real work." Sarah bit her tongue and continued working. She had learned that responding to Jessica's comments only made things worse. Instead, she focused on providing excellent service to her passengers, even if her own crew didn't appreciate her efforts. 3 hours into the flight, while serving beverages in the middle section, Sarah noticed David Kumar had grown more agitated. He kept staring out the window and checking his phone, despite being told multiple times that cellular service wasn't available at cruising altitude. "Mr. Kumar, is everything all right?" she asked quietly, crouching beside his seat. "I keep thinking about something my colleague mentioned yesterday," he whispered. "He works in defense contracting and said there were rumors about increased military activity in Eastern Europe, more than what's being reported on the news." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered Captain Williams' brief mention of political tensions during the briefing. What kind of activity? Missile deployments, mainly. Russian forces moving equipment closer to NATO borders. "My friend said commercial flight paths might be affected, but airlines weren't being told the full scope of the situation." Before Sarah could respond, the plane shuddered slightly. The captain's voice came over the intercom with the familiar ding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." But this felt different from normal turbulence. Sarah had experienced thousands of bumps and jolts during her flying career, and this was something else entirely. The plane seemed to hesitate in the air, as if something was pulling at it. She made her way to the galley where Jessica was securing loose items with practiced efficiency. "Did that feel like normal turbulence to you?" Sarah asked. "Turbulence is turbulence, rookie," Jessica replied dismissively. "You'll learn to tell the difference eventually." But Sarah's instincts told her otherwise. She had always been observant, a trait that had served her well in customer service, but often irritated her colleagues who preferred to stick to routine procedures. The next few hours passed without incident, but Sarah couldn't shake her unease. She found herself paying closer attention to the subtle sounds of the aircraft, the way the engines hummed, the slight vibrations through the floor. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt wrong. During dinner service, she overheard 2 passengers in business class discussing news they had seen before boarding. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a political science professor, was explaining to her traveling companion about rising tensions between NATO and Russia. "The situation is more volatile than what's being reported," Dr. Foster was saying. "Commercial aviation could become caught in the middle if things escalate. Airlines often aren't informed about military activities that could affect flight safety." Sarah pretended to be focused on collecting dinner trays while listening to their conversation. Dr. Foster continued explaining how commercial aircraft had been mistaken for military targets in previous conflicts, particularly in areas with heightened military activity. "The problem is that civilian flights follow predictable routes," Dr. Foster explained. "If military forces are expecting enemy aircraft in certain corridors, a commercial plane could easily be misidentified, especially at night or in poor weather conditions." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. She thought about David Kumar's concerns and the unusual turbulence they had experienced earlier. Her training had covered emergency procedures, but nothing had prepared her for the possibility of being caught in international military tensions. As the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, Sarah found it impossible to rest during her scheduled break. While other crew members dozed in their seats, she remained alert, listening to every sound the aircraft made. Around 2 a.m. local time, she noticed unusual activity in the cockpit area. Captain Williams and First Officer Jackson were having what appeared to be an intense discussion with someone on the radio. Their body language suggested concern, possibly alarm. Sarah approached the cockpit area cautiously. Flight crews were trained to handle various emergencies, but the tension she sensed was different from routine operational discussions. "Is everything all right?" she asked Captain Williams during a brief lull in his radio communications. "Just some route adjustments," he replied, but his expression suggested it was more complicated than that. "Air traffic control is being very specific about our flight path tonight." "More specific than usual?" Captain Williams glanced around to ensure other crew members weren't listening. "We're being vectored around some areas that were clear when we filed our flight plan. ATC isn't giving us details, just new headings." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Could it be weather-related? Negative. Weather is clear in those sectors. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Sometimes commercial flights get rerouted when military exercises are taking place. It's probably nothing serious. But the way he said it suggested he wasn't entirely convinced himself. As Sarah returned to the main cabin, she noticed several passengers were awake despite the late hour. Many were looking out windows, though there was little to see except darkness and occasional lights far below. Mrs. Chen flagged her down as she passed. "Dear, I've been flying for 40 years, and something feels different tonight," the elderly woman said quietly. "The plane seems to be changing direction more than usual." Sarah had noticed the same thing. Commercial flights typically followed relatively straight paths between waypoints, but tonight they seemed to be making frequent course corrections. "The pilots are just avoiding some weather," Sarah replied, not wanting to alarm the passenger while feeling increasingly concerned herself. She spent the rest of her shift moving through the cabin, checking on passengers and trying to appear calm while her anxiety mounted. The aircraft continued making subtle course changes, and she could hear frequent radio chatter from the cockpit. Around 4 a.m., David Kumar approached her in the galley area. His face was pale and drawn. "I've been thinking more about what my colleague told me," he whispered. He mentioned that Russian forces were moving surface-to-air missile systems closer to international flight corridors. If commercial aircraft accidentally enter restricted airspace. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah understood the implications perfectly. Commercial airliners had been shot down before when military forces mistook them for enemy aircraft. "Have you noticed we keep changing direction?" David continued. "I've been tracking our route on my phone's compass. We're definitely not following a normal flight path." Sarah glanced around to make sure Jessica wasn't nearby. "I noticed it too. The captain mentioned some route adjustments." "Route adjustments at 35,000 feet over the North Atlantic usually mean someone wants us to avoid something specific," David said grimly. "And, given the current political situation," before Sarah could respond, the aircraft banked sharply to the left. It wasn't a gentle course correction, but a definitive turn that caused several passengers to wake up and look around in confusion. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making a slight course adjustment due to air traffic control instructions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But Sarah could hear the strain in Captain Williams' voice. This wasn't routine. She made her way back to the cockpit area where she found Captain Williams in heated discussion with air traffic control. Through the partially open cockpit door, she could hear fragments of the conversation. "Negative, we cannot maintain current heading. Request immediate clearance to alternate route. Understand the urgency." First Officer Jackson noticed Sarah listening and quietly closed the cockpit door, but not before she heard one more chilling phrase from the radio. "Multiple military aircraft in your vicinity. Maintain current heading until further notice." Sarah's training kicked in as she realized they were facing a situation far beyond normal operational procedures. The aircraft was potentially in danger, and, as crew, she had a responsibility to be prepared for emergency actions. She began mentally reviewing evacuation procedures and emergency equipment locations, hoping desperately that such knowledge would remain theoretical. But, As the night progressed and the aircraft continued its erratic course changes, Sarah realized that her dismissive colleagues might soon need every bit of skill and preparation she possessed. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, and Sarah gripped the galley counter as she felt the aircraft begin what seemed like an emergency descent. Over the intercom, Captain Williams' voice was calm but urgent. "Flight attendants, prepare for immediate emergency procedures." As Sarah reached for the emergency manual, she caught Jessica's eye across the cabin. For the first time in 6 years, the senior flight attendant was looking at her not with condescension, but with something that might have been respect. The dismissed cabin crew member was about to prove that sometimes the most underestimated person becomes the most valuable when crisis strikes.